Welcome to this explainer. Today we're zooming out, taking a grand, cinematic look at a genuinely mind-blowing period in history. We're talking about how a single generation, literally just one generation right after World War II, completely redrew the map of the world. We'll be diving into the massive wave of decolonization, the shifting power dynamics in the Middle East, and of course, the dramatic, world-altering end of the Cold War.
So, how exactly did a single generation manage to redraw the entire global map? I mean, how does the world transform that rapidly? Well, to wrap our heads around this, we've got to look at two massive, totally simultaneous shifts that define the second half of the 20th century. On one hand, you have this unstoppable tide of independence movements just sweeping across continents, and on the other, the incredibly complex and ultimately terminal retreat of Soviet power.
Part 1. The Wave of Independence. We're going to start right at the breaking point of the old European empires. This was a momentous shift, one that actually created an entirely new geopolitical category, what we eventually came to know as the Third World. The absolute key here is understanding decolonization. Think of it as this incredibly powerful wave, driven both by European empires being severely weakened after World War II and by the rapid, unstoppable spread of ideals like sovereignty and self-determination. This wasn't just some bureaucratic political change, right? It was a fundamental reordering of global identities. Nations all across Asia and Africa were finally breaking free, claiming their undeniable right to just choose their own futures. Just look at how fast this cascaded globally in the post-war years. It actually starts during the war, back in 1941, when Roosevelt and Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which affirmed the right of everyday people to choose their own governments. And wow, did that start a fire. By 1945, Indonesia is declaring independence from the Netherlands. Fast forward to 1947, after decades of Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, you have a financially exhausted Britain overseeing the transfer of power. That gives us the Indian Independence Act, and unfortunately, the deeply tragic, bloody partition of India and Pakistan. Then, by 1957, Kwame Nkrumah successfully leads Ghana to become the very first sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence. Now, what's super fascinating here is how these newly sovereign nations actively navigated the insane superpower pressure of the Cold War. They didn't go through all that struggle just to swap out European colonial rulers for American or Soviet masters. No way. Instead, they established a concept called non-alignment. Basically, this was a deliberate, hardline stance rejecting alignment with either the Western capitalist bloc or the Soviet communist bloc. It was their way of carving out a totally independent path in a deeply, intensely divided world. And that brings us to a truly monumental gathering. In 1955, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia brought together 29 Asian and African nations. And their main goal? To declare absolute solidarity, to oppose colonialism in literally all its forms, and to firmly reject having to pick a side between the superpowers. This historic conference actually laid the essential groundwork for the non-aligned movement, which got officially formalized a few years later in 1961. It was such a bold, powerful statement of unity on the global stage. Moving on to part 2, the birth of Israel and Middle Eastern geopolitics. Let's shift our focus over to the Middle East and look at how rising Arab nationalism intersected with another profound, decades-long historical movement, ultimately leading to some pretty dramatic changes on the map. First, we really must pause and solemnly acknowledge this number. 6 million. That represents the Jewish lives systematically murdered in the Holocaust during World War II. This horrific atrocity dramatically strengthened international sympathy, convincing governments all over the world that European Jewry urgently, desperately needed a secure, sovereign homeland of their own. And this tragedy directly energized Zionism. Now, when this decades-long campaign for a secure Jewish homeland in Palestine intersected with post-war geopolitics and the concurrent rise of Arab nationalism in the region, it produced what would become one of the most consequential new states of the entire era. The map of the region changed decisively in November of 1947. That's when the United Nations voted to partition British-controlled Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Once Britain officially withdrew, Israel declared its independence under Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. This was May 14, 1948. And almost immediately following this declaration, neighboring Arab states launched an invasion. The resulting cycle of wars led to massive, widespread displacement. The displacement of Palestinians during this time is known as the Nakba. The sheer gravity of these events, the partition, Israeli independence, and the Nakba, initiated an incredibly complex geopolitical reality, one that continues to deeply shape Middle Eastern politics to this very day. Part 3, Superpowers and the Third World. Now, as all these new borders were being drawn and new nations were emerging, these newly independent countries quickly woke up to find themselves caught on a very dangerous, very global chessboard. This introduces us to the true dark side of the era, proxy conflict. You see, instead of fighting each other directly, which, meant risking total nuclear annihilation, the United States and the Soviet Union intervened repeatedly in Third World affairs. Time and time again, both superpowers were willing to completely undermine democratically elected governments if they viewed those governments as unfavorable to their own strategic Cold War interests. When we look closely at the historical record, a pretty undeniable pattern of regime change and covert interventions emerges globally. Take 1953, for instance. The CIA helps overthrow Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh, largely because he nationalized Iran's oil industry. The very next year, in 1954, the U.S. backs a coup against President Arbenz in Guatemala. And then jump to 1960, during the incredibly tense Congo crisis. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba is assassinated, with substantial evidence pointing directly to CIA involvement. These actions were driven by deep Cold War paranoia and high-stakes economic interests, and they severely compromised the very independence these nations had just shed blood to achieve. Section 4. Cracks in the Soviet system. So, while the superpowers were aggressively meddling abroad, back home, a series of interconnected internal and diplomatic forces were slowly but very surely fracturing the Soviet empire from within. The first major crack actually came through diplomacy. Back in 1972, President Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger made these landmark visits to Beijing and Moscow, which initiated a period known as détente. This was a crucial easing of Cold War hostility through direct summit diplomacy. It really opened up a whole new phase of arms limitation agreements, like SALT I. But internally, a much larger structural problem was brewing. The Soviet command economy, which was entirely centrally controlled by the state, was quite literally buckling. It just stagnated under the enormous, absolutely crushing weight of the military spending required to try and match American defense budgets. This became especially obvious later on, during the much more confrontational strategy of the 1980s under President Reagan. Furthermore, these big diplomatic agreements actually started having massive unintended domestic consequences for the Soviets. Take the 1975 Helsinki Accords, signed by 35 nations. It established strict human rights commitments. And those commitments? They ended up giving a powerful, legitimate voice to dissidents. It totally energized growing nationalist movements in Soviet republics like Ukraine, Estonia, and Lithuania. The whole union was straining from the inside out. Finally, Part 5, the fall of the wall. This long, slow retreat of Soviet power finally culminated in the late 1980s. And the crazy thing is, it wasn't just high-level diplomacy that ended the Cold War. It was everyday popular uprisings and the profound, totally unintended consequences of domestic reform. We can practically watch this build into a total system collapse, step by step. It kicks off with nonviolent civic resistance, like electrician Lech Walensa's Solidarity movement in Poland, which somehow organized millions of workers and actually won semi-free elections in 1989. Then you have Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introducing these sweeping domestic reforms. But instead of saving the system like he planned, demands for independence just surge everywhere. This sparks massive popular uprisings across Eastern Europe, climaxing with the dramatic and incredibly, totally accidental opening of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, literally all because of an East German official's bungled miscommunication at a press conference. And finally, on Christmas Day, December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigns, and the Soviet Union formally dissolves into 15 independent republics. So the crucial point we really have to emphasize here is the ironic role of Gorbachev's reforms. His twin policies were glasnost, which meant openness, and perestroika, which meant restructuring. The plan was to loosen censorship and decentralize the sluggish economy. But by giving the public just a little taste of freedom, he unexpectedly unleashed democratic revolutions that Moscow could simply no longer contain. Which means this incredible half-century leaves us with a seriously complex legacy. On the bright side, we see the triumph of self-determination drastically expanding UN membership, alongside the inspiring proof that peaceful civic resistance really can dismantle deep-rooted authoritarianism. We also entered this unique unipolar moment where the US stood alone as the sole superpower, and NATO expanded eastward, a move that, as we know, sparked security debates that are still raging today.
But on the flip side, we are left with the massive unfinished business of those arbitrary borders originally drawn by European colonizers. Borders that continue to fuel agonizing ethnic conflicts and political instability across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. So, as we wrap up this cinematic sweep of history, from the chaotic end of global empires to the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to consider. Just how much of our modern political instability, our current border disputes, and our ongoing global tensions is simply the unfinished business of this one incredible generation of change. Thanks for exploring this vital history with me today.